Let's defend Scripture from another angle now. Are some of the Bible stories borrowed from the myths of the nations around Israel? And then if so, does that mean that these stories are just myths? Or, even, Adam, Noah, Sodom, the Jonah story, the really far out there stories, these are real?
It's going to take me a minute to answer that.
Okay.
I'll do my best. There are some similarities between some of these stories in the Bible and the ancient Near East that are myths. The creation story, there are these cosmogonies that are myths about how the cosmos came into being. There's a story about a flood in the Mesopotamian myths. And of course, then we have a flood story in the Bible. So really, does the Bible partake in these myths, or are these just mythical stories? When you look at them very carefully, maybe one of the best examples is the creation account in Genesis chapter 1. Some would say, well, that's just, the author of Genesis is just reflecting the general idea of the myth of how the world came into being from the Mesopotamian myths. But when you start looking at Genesis carefully, in the ancient Near Eastern myths, there are multiple gods that are in existence in the beginning. There's only one God in Genesis 1. Furthermore, you've got pre-existing matter already there in the ancient Near Eastern myths. A god is cut in two, and that forms the cosmos. Whereas in Genesis 1, I think we do have a creation from nothing. Some evangelicals have argued that's not the case, that you just begin, verse 1 is the title, and verse 2, and there was chaos and emptiness, and the Spirit was hovering over it. But elsewhere, certainly, in the Bible, I think there's the notion of a creation from nothing. So we've got a creation from nothing. Ancient Near Eastern myths, you start with already existing matter. And if you start with God and already existing matter, then you've got a dualism. God has to stand behind it all. So some have said, yeah, there's some similarities between the ancient Near East and Genesis 1, but Genesis 1 is intentionally, it has some of these similarities to show that it's the true account. It's a kind of a polemic against the ancient Near Eastern accounts. I think that there are a number of ways that you can look at these similar accounts, whether it's the creation, whether it's the flood. And first way is that they're polemics, that there's an intentional borrowing by the biblical writer, and there's some changes. It's not just unconsciously adopted to show that this is the true account. And secondly, you probably do because of common grace. God communicates in a general way to all of humanity. Remember Romans 1, that unbelievers perceive God's eternal attributes, the eternal attributes of the invisible God. So, for example, Psalm 29 speaks of God, Yahweh, as the Lord of nature. He's the Lord of fire and of the storm and of the rain. And it's actually directly borrowed from the attributes of Baal, the fertility god of the Canaanites. So some say, well, here's another example, just unconscious borrowing. No, what the author is saying is what the Canaanites realized by common grace that they attributed to their God. Well, they're right, those are divine attributes, but it's only true of the one God of Israel. Some similarities, thirdly, can come about by common traditions. For example, the creation story. Probably the reason you have so many creation stories and flood stories, by the way, every culture, even today, some Indian cultures, some cultures and other areas still have these flood stories, and they have a creation story. Why is that? Well, you could say with creation, everybody has to account for how things came into being. Okay, but how about a flood story? Why in the world? I remember I went to a college in my second year. I'd been to a military school my first year in college, and when I went to another university, transferred, and found out I could take Bible for credit. I was so excited, and immediately I got in there. I'd just become a Christian, and the professor said, creation story's a myth, the flood story's a myth. Every culture has it. And I kind of feebly raised my hand and said, well, if every culture has a flood story, isn't that kind of weird? I said, maybe a lot of these cultures have garbled forms of a true story. So my point is that I think probably you do have these ancient traditions that arise from true reports, and then they become garbled. Scripture gives us, for example, of the Noah story and the flood there, I think, a true account. But there's similarities because you're going to have common ancient traditions. And fourthly, I do think sometimes the biblical writers will borrow things from the ancient Near Eastern world. Take circumcision. Circumcision pre-existed the nation of Israel. Well, did Israel just borrow it and unconsciously, they have circumcision, we'll have it too? I think that they adopt it, and then God fills it with His special revelatory truth. Same is true with temples. If you look at the temples of Israel and of the ancient Near East, they're all tripartite. They have 3 sections. They have all this floral imagery in it. And it may be that Israel was commissioned to have a temple like the ancient Near East, but filled with new revelatory content. Though I tend to think that the reason there are similarities is they all go back to a common ancient tradition of Eden as a temple. And that's why you've got so much floral imagery in those temples. So those are 4 ways that you can look at these similarities between the myths in the ancient Near East and the Bible and some of the stories, and very consistent with a high view of Scripture. A 5th way is not consistent. And that is that the Israelite authors, they just unconsciously imbibed these myths, and they became, they thought they perhaps were true myths, but they really weren't, and they used them to explain how the world came into being, or Noah's flood, whatever. One thing about Israel, they knew that they were different from other peoples. And I think it's unlikely that they were going to be unconsciously borrowing myths from the gods of the nations around. They knew that the Lord was one God. That's one huge difference already. So those are, I think, 4 ways, first 4 ways that you can see why there are these similarities. The 5th way, I don't think works. So I think maybe I should leave it at that. Yeah. I'd be happy if anybody wanted to press a little further, because it's a huge topic.
Yeah.